What the scariest true story you know? This one kid back in the early 20th century named Bobby Dunbar, he went missing, and after like a year of searching for him, his parents came across a man with a kid who looked a lot like Bobby. They believed it was their kid, and after a legal battle with the kid's supposed mother, they brought the kid home. A wild-ass parade happened due to the missing kid's return. He lived and died believing he was, in fact, Bobby Dunbar. Well, a few decades later, his granddaughter asked Bobby's nephew, I think, for a DNA sample so she could see if her and Bobby's nephew were related. Turns out, they weren't, meaning the real Bobby Dunbar is still missing and probably died alone without his parents. April 9th. Everyone but my mom had the chance to come and say goodbye. She doesn't drive and my dad works 10 hours away. My grandpa kept saying her name. Well, saying. He couldn't eat or drink so it was more like a whisper. My mom came by on the 10th. He looked at her. Smiled. Whispered my Amy. He closed his eyes and never opened them again. The exact thing happened with my grandpa. He was in an almost comatose state and survived 2 weeks past where the doctors, hospice nurse said should have been possible. His oldest son hasn't been able to come see him because he lives out of state and his wife was getting a serious surgery that was life or death and couldn't be postponed. Finally he was able to fly down to see grandpa one last time, spend a few hours with him, and then grandpa passed. Death is so strange. My grandma suffered from dementia for many years before she passed. It got so bad she didn't remember who her family were, and would barricade herself in her home because she was scared of everyone. She even forgot she smoked and would find her cigarettes months later after forgetting where they were and claim she was desperate for one. She'd put them away after one and that would be her again for months. The only memories she had left at the end was that her sister used to be able to play the piano beautifully and her husband, her childhood sweetheart, was gone but she didn't know where. He died some time earlier. She spent her days waiting for him to come home from wherever he was. My John will be home soon she would say, or someone would walk past the window and she'd double take and say thought that was my John. It was heartbreaking watching her deteriorate until she was on her deathbed, unaware of anything or anyone. I went to say my goodbyes to her in the hospital and she held my hand and told me how much she loved me but how she was ready to go be with John now. In that moment, she remembered who I was, what was happening to her and that her husband, my granddad, had gone already. She went in her sleep not long after that, and I'm forever thankful I managed to say goodbye and tell her how much I loved her too. I've held on to that moment for so long without really digesting it in any way that writing this just wore my heart out. I miss them both so much but I know they're finally together again somewhere. I have an amazing one. My great-grandmother lived a very long and interesting life. She was in her 20s in the Great Depression. She had a wild streak from those days that we don't know much about, to the point that we actually don't know our great-grandfather's name, just the husband she took later. Over the course of her nearly 100-year life, she had collected owls, literally thousands of owl figurines. She had clocks, wall hangings, pot holders, lamps, stained glass art, salt shakers, and more little figurines than you could imagine, all depicting owls. We all wondered the importance of the owls. She never talked about them. We just all knew she loved owls. Well, when she was nearing death, at the age of 98 or 99, and the docs said she had days, my grandparents went and talked to her and they asked her if she had anything she wanted to share or ask before she goes. She thought for a moment, then said, I never understood the owls. It turns out, she didn't really give a shit about owls. Near as we could piece together sometime in the 40s or 50s perhaps, she bought either a trivet or a set of salt, pepper shakers that were owls. Then someone got her the other. Those were the oldest owls anyone could remember. But from there, someone got her an owl to match. probably a potholder or placemat, and all of a sudden her kitchen was owl-themed. From there, it snowballed. The owls flowed like wine, baffling her for 60 years, eventually taking over as the bulk of her personal belongings. The moral is, if you're not actually into something, mention it early. Not my story but that of a hospice worker who spoke to my class. For those who don't know, hospice is a method of end-of-life care that focuses on alleviating the emotional and physical pain of a dying person to ease their passing rather than combating their imminent death. One of her patients was a bed-bound woman in her 90s who was generally unresponsive but had flashes of recognition and engagement. It's hard to gauge the level to which unresponsive patients are detached from their surroundings, so they encourage family members to keep their company in hopes of soothing the patient. Now this patient was from a U.S. state that prided itself on its state university, and the university's football team. The woman's family had attended this university for 4 or 5 generations during her hospice care. However, her great-granddaughter was the first in their family to decide to go to a different school, the rival state's university. In fact, her family was supportive of her decision but often joked about her being the rebel or Judas or what have you. One day, they were all sitting around the woman's bedside, teasing the girl about her decision. Suddenly, the patient sat up, looked at her great-granddaughter, said, "Traitor," and fucking died. Edit. Wow. Thank you for all the awards. I'm glad you all enjoyed the story. I heard it 4 years ago and I still think and laugh about it often. The hospice worker said that the family thought it was hilarious. This isn't a confession, but I just wanted to share the last thing my grandfather said to me before he passed away due to lung cancer. I was about to go to Rome for a school trip and my family told me to go to set my mind on something else for a few days. Before I left, I wanted to say goodbye as it was possibly the last time I could talk to him. He told me, "Have fun, boy. I'll see you next week." I went to Rome and when I came back, he was already in a deep sleep due to medication. He wanted to peacefully pass away while sleeping. I came back the next week and he was sleeping when I went to visit him. I told him everything I did in Rome even though I knew he wouldn't wake up. The next morning he passed away. My grandmother said to me, "He waited for you." I still miss him so much. My grandfather, who had not been a religious man throughout his life, stated on the second to last day he was alive that in the prior few nights he was seeing beings in the bedroom with him. He could not discern what they were but one in particular made him very fearful. My dad has a special ability to gain people's trust, in a good way. Twice now he's had instances where dying people tell him things that they feel they can't tell their family. The one case was when my aunt's mother-in-law was dying. She explained to my dad that her husband cannot live alone and that they both agree he must find a new partner after she passes. He did. He remarried within a year of her passing, at the age of 81. The family was very upset about him moving on so fast. My dad had to stand up for him and reassure them that it is what his late wife wanted. My time to shine. I worked at a hospital in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, a small town near Munich for the last 14 years. My job there is not fancy at all. I move people around, throw the trash out and occasionally I take care of some handy-like work, fix a leaking shower head and stuff like that. As you can imagine, I get to see a lot of patients that come and go. Some of them pass away, such is life, I guess. I remember a few instances of people confessing to me their biggest regrets. Here are some examples. An old Polish woman told me that she regretted not fucking Hitler when she had the chance. Her words. I wanted to ask her about more context, but I was afraid to be honest. Another notable example was an old truck driver that used to work for an Eastern Germany company. He told me that he once ran over some kids with his truck and was too afraid to stop and check if they were okay. Once another Polish lady told me that she used to be a prostitute during Second World War and that she slept with very high-up people in the government. She told me that she did not regret that part of her life, but that she could not tell anyone and that was a heavy emotional drag. She also told me that she aborted more than 5 babies during that time. When I was in hospital, the guy in the bed next to me just asked to stop taking his meds as he was ready to die. Last thing I heard him say was, "There's no one waiting for me at home, so I'm going where they are." Wasn't really a shocking confession, just a lonely and heartbreaking one. A couple of days before my grandmother passed away, she was really confused and was talking about my mother having a child a year or so after my own birth that was sent for adoption. She was talking about how sad and horrible this was and that I deserved to know. After my grandmother passed, I confronted my mom about it and she neglected this, and I truly believed her. Couple of months later, it turns out my grandmother was the one adopting away a baby girl who was born between my mother and aunt. My grandfather had pretty terrible dementia and he kept making deathbed confessions as he knew he didn't have much time left. They were often about witnessing a murder and not telling anyone. But each time he confessed to us, the details changed. It happened a couple of times a day over the course of his final week. We finally figured out that he would watch the local news and hear about these things happening, then would think he had actually witnessed them. We had a similar situation in our extended family. Alzheimer's made this family member insanely paranoid. He thought that people were constantly trying to break into his home and murder him. Turns out his wife was watching lots of crime shows around him and he could no longer distinguish reality from fiction. I didn't see it, but my aunt watched her elderly mother fall down the stairs and confessed just before she died that she wasn't her biological mother. She told my aunt that her oldest sister was actually her mother. The sister had gotten pregnant too young and the mom said it was hers, a common way of handling it back then. She revealed it in her very last breath. My great-uncle actually confessed to having 2 illegitimate sons right before he kicked the bucket in front of his own children and grandchildren. The crazy thing was that none of his children knew this life of his. Not even my great-aunt knew about it because she would have made a huge fuss if she was alive at that time and knew about it. What was crazier was that these 2 sons already passed away 5 and 7 years ahead of him respectively. He was 98 years old and his invisible sons were 65 and 69 years old. The children found out that one of his invisible sons actually was a teacher at a school that his granddaughters attended when they were in high school. Nevertheless, his children decided to reach out to the children of his invisible sons. They got connected and learned more stuff about my granduncle. The craziest thing was that I actually dated one of the granddaughters of one of the invisible sons. The one passed away at the age of 69 years old. Talking about a few degrees of separation, I helped care for my dad as he died from cancer earlier this year. He would get agitated and reach his arms out and try to sit up. The last thing he said was "Fuya ugh." Not sure what it was referencing, pain, drugs, or war memories, but that stuck with me. He passed very peacefully in the end. Not a deathbed confession exactly. I was a hospice volunteer and worked with a man with a brain tumor. He was in pretty shape except for that. He was going nuts in the nursing home and one day I took him for a ride around town. He had grown up there. Seemed like every other block he would point at an old building and say used to be a whorehouse there. Empty lot. Used to be a building there and it had a pretty good whorehouse there. There was a whore there until it burned down. We passed by this old odd-looking apartment building that had more doors than it should have and it appeared some of them were sealed up. He said that used to be a crib and each door had a small room behind it and each whore had her own room. We passed under a railroad bridge and he pointed a flat area and there used to be black women that ran the best whorehouse in the state right there. I finally laughed her and said, "Guess I know what you spent your youth doing." Not a deathbed confession, but the last conversation I had with my grandfather has always stuck with me. He had Parkinson's, and lived on a farm outside of town. One day he looked at me and said, "I'm getting too old to take care of Mom, my grandmother. I need you to do that for me, okay?" His health deteriorated pretty rapidly from that point onward. I still call my grandmother every single day, and try to get back home whenever I can to help out around the farm. This was posted here the last time. The story is about a woman who was found pushing her baby had been dead on a swing for 2 days. The baby died from hypothermia and dehydration. She was found not criminally negligent due to schizophrenia. Here is the article. Absolutely horrifying. A woman 2 blocks away from my house had multiple children and was pregnant again. I heard my mom talking about her. She has more kids than me and she about to have another. She's crazy. Mom had 6 of us. One day the lady wasn't pregnant anymore, and there was no baby to be found. Someone told the police about it. The police questioned them and raided their home. They found the newborn dead and stuffed in the freezer. I worked in forensic medicine. My boss had to perform an autopsy on a chopped-off head that was found by 2 completely traumatized children. The autopsy itself took 7 hours because the person had over 56 different injuries to the head. This isn't a scary story, but it's spooky and always captured my imagination. One day a bunch of, I think they were police in training, explored some of the catacombs under Paris. A lot of them are completely unmapped. They entered an area and heard dogs barking and snarling. They continued going and saw there were speakers mounted on the wall, playing pre-recorded dog sounds and cameras. They continued. They came into this huge opening and found a cinema. It was lavishly decorated. It had projectors and a mix of old and new movies. It even had electricity running and 3 phone lines. The police marked where they were and went back outside. The next day they returned to try and investigate further with more experienced officers. Everything was gone. All the wiring had been ripped out. All the furniture was gone. All that remained was a note that said, "Do not try to find us." As far as I know, they never figured out who was there. Edited to correct some mistakes. Alice and Bota. On December 18, 1994, Port Elizabeth resident Alison Bota was abducted, raped, stabbed and left for dead by Franz Dutoit and Thunz Kruger. They slashed her throat 17 times. So deep she had to hold her own head on as she crawled to the road for help. With her other hand she had to hold in the organ spilling from her stomach, where she had been stabbed more than 30 times. By some miracle the knife thrusts had missed her main arteries, so she did not bleed to death and was able to breathe through her severed trachea. There is a documentary that is on Amazon Prime called Allison, worth the watch but might be traumatic for some viewers. Trailer for Allison. The story of the Lake Nyos disaster. The lake periodically belches a cloud of invisible carbon dioxide gas that suffocates everything within a 16-mile radius. In 1986, over 1,700 people in all their livestock died without even understanding what was happening to them. My father used to work as a medical examiner. He was the guy they sent when a crime scene contained a dead person, to give a preliminary examination of the corpse before it got sent off for more rigorous investigation. One of his worst stories was being called in for a child, around 9 or 10, that had ostensibly been killed in a drive-by shooting while he and his older brother were playing in the front yard. When my dad examined the corpse, however, the presence of gunpowder burns across his face indicated the shot must have been point blank. His older brother had lied about the shooting. He'd shot him himself. Murder of Sylvia Likens. The parents of Sylvia Likens left her with her caregiver. The caregiver used her sister as a coercive threat and along with her children and their friends tortured and killed her. This true story was also made into a 2007 movie, The Girl Next Door, which was based on the 1989 novel, The Girl Next Door.